The sun came up thin and white over the prairie, turning the scrub and mesquite into a wash of glare that stung tired eyes. Within the stone walls of Presidio La Bahia, near the little town of Goliad, the air already smelled of dust and sweat and old gunpowder. Men lay shoulder to shoulder on the packed ground, ankles bound, wrists rubbed raw by rope. They were Colonel James Fannin's command, prisoners since the fight at Coleto Creek, men who had stacked their muskets and surrendered because they'd been promised they would live. Fannin's leg throbbed where the ball had shattered bone a week earlier. He sat propped in a chair near the chapel, stubborn jaw set, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He had argued to retreat sooner. He had hesitated. He had lost the open field and the water at Coleto, and had taken the only path left to him, terms. General José de Urrea, disciplined and professional, had accepted that surrender and treated the wounded with a soldier's decency. The captured believed they would be paroled or exchanged. They whispered to one another about going home, about New Orleans, about the long walk north once this was all sorted out. But above Urrea stood Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and his orders rode the dusty roads faster than couriers could rest their horses. To Santa Anna, the Texians were not lawful combatants. They were insurgents, pirates, a contagion to be cauterized. His decree was cold and simple, spare none. Even as Urrea sent letters pleading clemency, warning that butchered prisoners would harden resistance, the command held. What came next would not be a battle. It would be administration. At dawn on Palm Sunday, March 27th, 1836, guards shook the prisoners awake and called the rolls. They told them to form into 3 columns for transfer, one toward the lower ford of the San Antonio River, another along the Victoria Road, the last toward the old Copano route. The men stood stiff and quiet, blinking into the brightness. Some limped. Some helped the wounded to their feet. A few attempted jokes the way soldiers do when they smell danger but can't name it. Fannin remained in the Presidio, under guard, his hat brim low against the glare. The first column marched out between files of Mexican infantry whose bayonets caught the sun like mirrors. No drums beat, no flags showed. Dust puffed at each step and drifted back over the barefoot men at the rear. The second column followed a separate lane through thorn and grass, while the third snaked slowly along the cart track where oxen had rutted the earth into hard grooves. The fort fell behind them until only the chapel dome rose over the brush like a white knuckle. A mile out, where the ground widened into open prairie, the file halted on a word. Some of the prisoners, thinking a rest break, turned to stretch their backs. Others faced forward because that was what they had been trained to do. Then, clear and ordinary as a drill command, came the order, "Fuego!" The front ranks of infantry lifted, fired, and reloaded with practiced hands. A sheet of smoke rolled across the line. Men dropped in tangled heaps, and those still standing flinched without yet understanding. The second volley tore through them at waist height. The third chased those who ran. Cavalry waited in a crescent behind the mesquite, sabers bright, pistols primed. They cut down the runners and pushed them back into the guns. The other columns heard the shots and tried to break, but every direction held steel. A few fell to their knees, hands up, calling out that they had surrendered once already. The answer was another volley. The air turned raw with powder, and the prairie grass shivered with the passage of bullets. Some men threw themselves toward the river bank and slid into the shallows. Horses splashed after them and trampled the mud red. Inside La Bahia, the gunfire reached Fannin like a weather change. He asked for 3 things: that he be shot in the heart, that his personal effects be sent to his family, and that his body be given a Christian burial. The first request was granted. The other 2 were swallowed by the machinery of the day. He was placed in a chair in the courtyard. The soldiers leveled muskets, and a single ball struck square. He folded without spectacle, another entry in an officer's ledger, that would never be shown to a court. Outside the walls, the killing ran on in bursts as small groups were found and finished. When ammunition pouches emptied, bayonets did their dull work. By late morning, the prairie lay stunned and quiet, except for the whicker of horses and the low human sounds that come after violence, the groans that fade, the prayers that taper to breath. Estimates would vary, but by any measure more than 300 prisoners were dead or dying. A handful lived by accident and willpower. Some had fallen early and lay still beneath the bodies of friends until the sun slid west. A German teenager named Hermann Ehrenberg slipped into the river and crawled through brush with the thorns tearing his hands. He would later write of powder smoke, of blood in his nose for days, of dreams that returned for years. Urrea returned to the aftermath and found the ground he had argued against making. His diary would carry the shame of it. He called the executions useless and dishonoring. He wrote that he had warned Santa Anna of the consequence, that cruelty closes the fist it tries to force open. The bodies lay where they had fallen until details could drag them into rows and set fires among them, the grease of human fat feeding flames that nobody wanted to tend. Vultures spiraled. Wolves nosed close at dusk. News moves faster than armies when carried by horror. Couriers found Sam Houston's camp and poured Goliad into it on top of the Alamo. Grief hardened into a single idea. Volunteers arrived with their jaws set, farm boys and trappers and immigrants with old debts to new tyrants, all of them repeating the same words. When Houston finally loosed his line at San Jacinto a month later, the battle cry came from two graves. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. 18 minutes later, the Mexican army broke. Santa Anna was captured in a swamp. The Republic of Texas, a precarious notion, suddenly became a map. Goliad did not become famous in the way the Alamo did. Too few walls to make a postcard, too little romance in men shot after surrender. But on the ground itself, the memory ran deep. For weeks, travelers on the Victoria Road held cloths to their faces. The sun worked like an agent over the bodies until bones showed in the grass. Later that spring, Texian troops returned, gathered what they could find, and built a pyre from mesquite and brush. The ashes were shoveled into a pit near the chapel. Years afterward, bones still surfaced after floods and were tucked back into the earth by rough hands. Time kept moving. Railroads came and went. The Presidio fell into neglect, and then, as Texans learned to tend their scars, was restored stone by stone. A granite monument rose over the burial mound, with names carved where memory could provide them, and blank spaces where it could not. Locals talked about lantern lights seen drifting across the field on windless nights. Maybe tricks of the eye, maybe cattlemen cutting across after dark. Maybe the mind returning to a place that insists on it. Walk there now, and the geometry of what happened remains. The gate the prisoners marched through still opens on dust and sun. The roads they took are there in the lay of the land, even if the ruts are long gone. You can stand where the columns halted and imagine how quiet it must have seemed just before the first volley. You can look back toward the white dome of the chapel and feel in the bright blank air the moment hope bent and did not rise again. Goliad is instructive precisely because it is not theatrical. It is the place where a promise was made, and another promise heavier and crueler arrived and crushed it. It is the proof that the shape of a nation can turn on what is done to unarmed men in the open. The tragedy at Goliad was not just a massacre. It was a fuse that burned into San Jacinto and beyond, into the story Texans told themselves and the way that story traveled. It taught rebels and rulers alike the cost of orders written far from the ground where they would be obeyed. It remains, under the huge South Texas sky, a lesson that breathes without raising its voice. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.